All right, so today's day 2 of our 1-week reading plan through Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus. All right, you got two things. One's a little like historical and contextual, and the other one will be a little more personal for you and me. But it's important to cover this historical, contextual stuff for a lot of this to make sense. In the ancient world, when the church first came out, there was this big question. And the question was, do you have to be Jewish to follow Jesus? Right? If you remember the whole timeline, God showed himself to the world in the form of this nation. It was the nation of Israel, the Jewish nation, right? Then Jesus came from there. Then he starts this movement, and everyone's like, okay, cool, this is a great thing. But do you have to be one of those Jewish people to be part of this? The answer, obviously, is no, right? Which I'm thankful for. But then there came this issue. All right, fine. So you don't have to be Jewish, but if you want to follow Jesus, do you have to become Jewish? And for them, that would have meant following the law or getting circumcised. And that's why this issue comes up so often in Paul's letters. He's like, no, this thing is for all people, for all nations, dating all the way back to Abraham, when God told Abraham, through you, all nations would be blessed. And you don't have to get circumcised to follow Jesus. So in other words, you don't have to become Jewish. So this issue comes up over and over and over again. Even Peter, years after Jesus is gone, Peter runs into this issue, and we see he's drifted in the wrong direction when it comes to where he stands on this. So Paul's just reiterating this over and over and over again. Now, there was this divide between Jewish people and non-Jewish people, and a big part of Paul's letter is the importance of not seeing a distinction between the two groups of people, how this dividing wall of hostility does not need to be there. So he talks about this a lot in the letter as early as chapter 1, and you might have missed this. I'm using a different translation. It's the NASB, which I think kind of exposes this issue a little bit better in the language. But this is in verse 12 of chapter 1. He says, he refers to himself and his fellow Jews as we who were the first to hope in Christ. That's a reference to Jewish people, even though he doesn't say that. Then right after that, he says, you also believed. He's speaking to non-Jews, to the Gentiles. That's the first time he makes the distinction. And then he does it again in the beginning of chapter 2, which is where we are today. He's like, you were dead in your old way of life. He says, you were living according to the prince of the power of the air that's at work in the sons of disobedience. This is language used to describe these Gentiles, right? And it sounds like he's throwing a jab. But then he brings himself back into it with his fellow Jewish people. And he's like, but among them, we too, meaning Jewish people, also previously lived, indulging in our flesh and our selfish desires. And so it's important that you see that when this issue comes up, he's trying to reinforce that the two are one. There should be no distinction. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're a follower of Jesus, and the playing field is level. We all show up with empty hands. And he really reinforces that at the end of chapter 2 when he says the two groups have become one. But in the middle, there's this beautiful part that comes up often in churches on Sunday morning, and I think really connects with us. He talks about how everyone's on this level playing field, how no one deserves God's goodness. And then he says, but God, being rich in mercy because of his great love for us. In the original language, it's his great love with which he loved us, love on top of love. He steps toward us when there's nothing we can do to connect with him. He initiates contact with us, the people that he loves. And then he goes into this passage which has become a famous verse. He says it's grace, it's by grace you've been saved. It's a gift that you cannot work for, you can't earn it. He says this, by grace you've been saved, which means helped or delivered. The New Testament writers use that word saved in past, present, and future, meaning you will be saved, you are being saved, and you have been saved. It means cared for by God in this big umbrella of followers of Jesus. And he's like, and that's a gift. Now watch this. Here's the takeaway, at least for me. He says, all of this is not a result of works, so no one can brag about it, right? It's not what you do, not a result of works. But in the very next line, he says, we're his workmanship, or yours might say his masterpiece, created in Jesus Christ for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we might walk in them. That we might live in them. So he contrasts the idea of works. There is a role, there's a place for good works. He's it's not the requirement for being in, but it is the response to it. Like, it is the natural, logical way we should respond to a God who cared so much for us, by showing people like how good life can be when you trust him and serve other people. And so there's a very intentional like joining together of those two ideas. You don't work to get in, but when you're in, it is the natural response. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing, especially how he says that like these situations are prepared for you beforehand. Like, you are going to experience people today, and imagine how differently you handle those experiences if you believe that God has set that situation up, that it's a divine appointment. It's an opportunity for you to do good work. That's what Paul's getting at here, and I think that's a pretty cool thing. So try to take that with you today. You're going to be in some situations with some people. Some you may like more than others, but what if each situation you're in today is one that has been prepared for you? How would that change the way that you walk in it? All right, that's day 2. Tomorrow's day 3. See you then.